This is part 3 of the Craftsman King Seeley 3-wheel bandsaw rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 2, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to discuss some things that I've purchased to complete this bandsaw rebuild, and we will be re-greasing the water pump bearing or agricultural shaft bearing or drive shaft bearing or whatever you want to call it, but we're going to have to build a jig to do that. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. At the end of part 2, I placed everything in a simple green bath, and I have rinsed it and then put everything in a citric acid bath. So the column and all the parts are in this citric acid bath. These aluminum and plastic parts went in the simple green bath, but they do not go in the citric acid bath. And I normally mention this in my drill press videos, but I'll mention it here. Any of your panels that have ink on them or writing on them, they're not going to go in either bath. They don't go in simple green or in the citric acid. Neither do any of the electrical components like the switch or the brushes or rubber parts. None of that's going to go in the simple green or the citric acid. It'll take the paint right off of that stuff. So anyways, now that that's out of the way, this is that drive shaft bearing. At least that's what they call it in the parts manual. It's probably most commonly known as a water pump bearing or an agricultural shaft bearing. Anyways, these come in a variety of sizes and whatnot, but you can't get the exact one you need for this bandsaw anymore. And you know, you could buy a used one, but you're just going to be in the same boat that we are right now. This thing is not running super smooth. So we need to build a jig so that we can grease it. So we need some grease fittings. We need a threaded cap, 4-inch nipple, that's 3/4 inch diameter, and then a 3/4 inch rubber coupler. So I purchased new needle bearings to replace the existing needle bearings. And these are Koyos, made in Japan, and these are B105s. You can see that I paid $31.26 for the 4. That included the tax and the shipping and all that junk. But the originals probably could have been cleaned up and reused, but I just wanted to go ahead and put new ones on. I do this with pretty much everything I rebuild. If I can put a new bearing on it, I will. Next up are the cool blocks. And for whatever reason, on Olson's website and even on eBay, the wrong ones are listed for this saw. You need the CB50040BL. So that's a model number you need if you're rebuilding this saw. Next are the long screws for the power panel. If you recall, I only had one, so I've got some truss screws here. I'm going to have to cut them down, but they've got the same head on them. They're threaded the whole length, but no big deal. You need a replacement power cable for the motor. Also for the power panel, we've got a male receptacle and 2 female receptacles. So the way the power panel works is you're going to use a drop cord to plug into the male receptacle, and then you'll have on the left and the right 2 female receptacles, and the one on the left is where you plug in the motor, and the one on the right is where you plug in your light. And then the light will always be hot and the motor will turn on with the flip of the switch on the power panel. And this is just the drop cord that I'm going to use. Nothing special there. Next, I got an insert for the table. Ordered this off of eBay. There's 2 different sizes. Make sure you get the proper one for the bandsaw you're rebuilding. And then my good buddy Matt Blast on Garage Journal Forum made me up new decals for the power panel. So these are a couple of images of the inside of one of those water pump bearings. And here, my good friend Frank Lee has torn away the shield and the cage, and you can see the inside of the bearing there. But you have to destroy the bearing to disassemble it. There's no way to take it apart without destroying it. And here you can see the shaft has two inner races on the center of the shaft that those bearings ride in. And that's why the only option you have is to re-grease these bearings. You can't, or replace them if you could find one, but you can't disassemble it and clean it and put it back together. So because of that, we are going to build a jig and we are going to re-grease this thing. So I've already drilled and tapped and installed the grease fitting on the end cap there. And so we're just going to thread that end cap onto this nipple. Now the other end of the nipple, you can kind of see it. I cut some notches in the bottom of it, and that's just to allow the grease to expand as much as possible. And we're just going to throw it in the vise here. My Autocrat, Colombian Autocrat. It's a rare vise that I love. And we'll crank this sucker down. Gonna need some channel locks for that. And so I don't want to break it, but I want it on there pretty tight. Next, we need to clean up this bearing. Before we try to grease it, I want to get those shafts on it as clean as possible. So there's a woodruff key on that bearing, and I already removed it when we take the bearing over to the lathe, but and I forgot to film it. But all you need is a pen and a hammer, and you can knock that woodruff key out. So you can see that there's a little slit where the woodruff key would normally sit. So I'm going to chuck this thing inside my lathe, and I'm going to use some sandpaper to just clean up the shaft and the outside of the bearing. So I'm starting with, I think that's 100 grit. I can't remember now, but I'm only going to apply pressure on the very ends of this shaft to clean up the ends of it. And then when I get on the shaft part itself, I'm lightly sanding it. And if I recall correctly, I sanded it from 100 all the way up to, I think, 320 or something like that, maybe 400 grit. I didn't wet sand. All I did was dry sand, because I'm not really trying to polish it. I'm just trying to clean it up. And then I'm just cleaning up that flat that's on there for the set screw. So once we're done with the lathe, we can go ahead and start assembling that jig. There's that woodruff key that I was talking about. It sits inside a little slit there, and the bottom of it is rounded. So once you start tapping it off of there, it should come off pretty easily. So I'm going to use a dental pick, and we just want to reach in the very outer edge of the seal that's on this and pry it inward and up. Try not to damage it. They're plastic, but it's a kind of a rubbery plastic. It's flexible, but you don't want to break it or tear it. So once we get it up, we can pull it off of there, and we'll do that for both sides. Now that's the cage that I was looking at there. We want to make sure we don't damage that cage. So when you do this, don't stab down into the bearing, because you could damage the cage, and if you damage the cage, then it's toast. But once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. We have to have these seals off to be able to put grease inside the bearing. So these bearings, they're actually on quite a few different things of this era. They're on all the bandsaws. They're on table saws. They're on the 6-inch by 42-inch belt sanders, and I'm sure plenty of other things use them as well. But I'm not sure if they're even the same size as this bearing. So I don't know that you could get one and use it on this saw. All right, so once we've got that cleaned up with some Q-tips and we've got the seals out, we're going to go ahead and slap that coupler on there. So it's a 3/4 inch coupler, I believe, and it fits on there really tight, which is what I want. You could probably use a little bit of oil to help it on there. That's why I've got that 3-in-1 oil sitting there, but I didn't want to use it. I don't want the oil to mix with the grease. I want it to all be as clean as possible. So I thought about flushing the bearing out with some transmission fluid or something like that, but there's just no way to make sure that I got it all out of the bearing before I start putting grease into that bearing. So I just, after talking with Frank Lee, I decided we're just going to pump grease into it and let it come out the other end and hope for the best. So I wanted to get that coupler about halfway down on the bearing, which is kind of where we are. And then we can put the pipe clamp back on there, or hose clamp, whatever you want to call it. And pay no attention to all those empty Simple Green bottles. As I said in a previous video, it was time to replace all the Simple Green. So those are going to be recycled. And then we're just going to stick the nipple in the top part. And here I'm going to measure. I'm feeling for where the top of that bearing is, and then make sure that I've got that nipple in there as far down as I can get it to rest on top of the bearing. And I should have put the hose clamp on before I did that, but I didn't. So, duh. We'll just open it all the way up and put it on. So obviously you're going to need a grease gun if you don't have one. And then you're going to need some pretty specific grease. The Mobile One bearing grease, if you can find it these days, is ridiculous expensive. So I opted for the CRC grease. I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. But it's made for electric motor bearings. So it's should do fine for this bearing as well, because this bearing will never spin at the speed that an electric motor bearing spins at. So this is CRC Lectra Lube electric motor grease. I got it off of Amazon, I think. It was like $14 for the tube. But we're just going to put it inside the grease gun, reassemble the grease gun. Yes, it's a cheap Harbor Freight Pittsburgh grease gun that I purchased an extra or more expensive fitting for the end there, quick release. And then we're going to start pumping grease into there. So that nipple is schedule 80 and it can handle this pressure. And as you can see, the grease is starting to come out the bearing. So once I've got it coming out all the way around that bearing, which we do now, Pump it a couple more times, and then we're going to start rotating the bearing. Then give it a couple more pumps. And some more rotation. And we should be good to go. So we'll release the pressure on the grease gun and then release the quick release on the fitting. And we have now re-greased that bearing. So we'll clean it up a little bit and then get it out of the jig. And I really wish that I had talked to Frankly about this when I rebuilt my other bandsaw and my table saw and my 6-inch sander, because I would have done this for all of those water pump bearings. And I still may go back and take them apart and do this. But yeah. And I had thought about possibly just getting a shaft and then getting 2 bearings that could sit side by side on that shaft. But getting the outside diameter of those bearings to be 30 millimeters, I think it is, and then it still fit a 1/2-inch shaft is next to impossible. So Frank and I talked about needle bearings, that there's got to be a way to do this where you can just replace bearings and not have to do this crazy water pump setup, but it's not as easy as you would think. Anyways, once we've cleaned up the bearing, we can go ahead and put the seals back on. So before I install the seal, I'm just using a Q-tip and I'm coating the top part of the cage inside the bearing with a little bit more of that same grease. And then I'll put the seal on it. And I did this for both sides. I just didn't show the first side. So when you're putting the seal on, just make sure you've got the right side facing up and just press it back into the recess that it sits in. And a little bit of grease will come out, no big deal. Clean it up with a Q-tip or a paper towel. And that's all there is to it. And that's going to wrap up this video. So the next video, we're going to be talking specifically about the slow speed converter, and we will get back on rebuilding this bandsaw. So hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.